you don't want to be on screen, go off screen now. Awesome. So we are so excited to be hosting Emily Flynn tonight. I met Emily through years of working as a postpartum doula in the Bay Area, and she has been such an amazing resource. I've referred so many families to her for sleep education, and she's just been a really supportive colleague and a really good friend. So really excited to have you. Emily Flynn is a doula, a podcaster. We will link the podcast in a little bit. A sleep educator, a researcher, and an author. She is here to share about tech culture and the parenting world, surveillance capitalism, and how these things impact birth workers and the family they serve. I know that those things were so prevalent, especially in the Bay Area, that was just this ever-present thing and ever-evolving. And so I'm really excited to see what she has to share with us tonight. So Emily, I will go ahead and let you take it from here.
Great, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really glad that Sarah reached out. I'm also very excited that the speaker series is back up and running. It's always been really great to have that. I do miss them being in person so much, but this is the pandemic tech world that we live in. So although there's, the obvious downsides of that, hopefully it means that lots of people are able to make it today and we're able to share and disseminate this information with other people. So there's, usually some pluses to tech. I have a few housekeeping things to point out as well before I start. One is that I'm not a technophobe, but in the past year and a half or so of doing this work is that my brain can't seem to function paying attention to the chat function while I am speaking. So I'm not intentionally ignoring it, but I do have to intentionally kind of block it out. So there's another housekeeping notice. My roommate's dog is half basset hound, so you'll probably hear him a bunch. But if you want to ask a question, you can feel very free to ask a question in the chat function, and Sarah and Rosalind and Kat and anyone else is going to help me basically jump in and do some of the moderating. And so I'm not ignoring your questions. It's just that I can't do them. I can't use the chat function as an immediate response, call and response situation. I also then build into my talks usually some breaks to make sure that people are on the same page or to answer kind of general questions. And also because I do really want to hear from folks. That's something that I feel like is harder to do in this tech landscape in a lot of ways, and I miss that. So I do want to hear from you, people who are working doulas, people who are just have broader questions and things like that. So I'm not going to ignore that. And then there's going to be a full Q&A session at the end, which I'm really excited about too. So you can, write your questions in the chat function. If we don't get to it somewhere throughout, we'll try and reach them at the end as well. So there's those things. And then, yeah, the dogs. All right, so hopefully some of this tech will work to present. I'm going to try and share my screen. I also want to say this is the first time I'm doing a formal presentation on this topic, though I've been talking about it in bits and bops a lot lately and writing about it a lot. This is the first time I'm doing a full kind of speaker presentation on it. So I'm definitely nervous because I don't know how linear it's going to be, but here's an attempt. Sorry, it's taking a sec to load. All right, sorry, of course, tech is failing me when I'm trying to present about technology. This always happens. I'll start talking then. just to not have dead space. So I wanna just kind of jump in and talk a little bit about why I actually care about this topic. I have to say that it has surprised me that this is something that I'm becoming known for. I actually almost failed computer science in college, which feels like a very kind of like tech myth origin story, to be someone who couldn't actually do the computing and then wound up trying to be a thinker and a personality on it. Seems pretty common. But it has been something that has been forced into my life and my practice for many years, and with increasing frequency. And it was one thing when it was happening in parenting spaces, and I felt like kind of on a more individualized level with clients, from client to client. I was having these one-on-one conversations about individual bits of tech. And then as I started to teach more and doing research, especially around infant sleep with birth workers, and through some of the studies I was doing in midwifery, I realized that the tech was becoming more ubiquitous, more ambient, it was unavoidable, and that so many of the questions I was getting in class, no matter what class I was teaching, were becoming increasingly about technologies. And so I was sort of wondering, when I was going to different groups, and I used to be one of the ethics chairs of the San Francisco Doula group, why we weren't talking about the way some of these technologies were impacting our work, impacting the viability of our work. And as I started looking more and more into it, into technology broadly, I'm still shocked that baby technology and kind of birth technology stuff still seems to be viewed as this niche thing. And so even in conversations about wearable technologies and telehealth and things like that, it's not talked about that much. They're like little puff pieces normally on a certain fertility app, or something like Clio, or these various things that are, and they're usually presented in one form. They're about productivity. They're about closing a gap supposedly in our like terrible maternity system, and this idea that it's somehow like helping fill some insurances in or gaps in insurance, and not digging into some critical dialogues that we see when we talk about or hear about wearable tech more broadly. So I know I have this like imposter syndrome fear, of course, that I am spending so much time compiling my thoughts, and somebody's going to write this book before I get a chance to. And then the more I talk to people in the publishing world, I realize that even so, I think a lot of the books that are, once they start mentioning reproductive technologies more often, they're still going to be from like a technologist perspective. And I'm hoping that having worked within reproductive health for the past 12 years, and I had a couple of years experience working in childcare otherwise, that the voices of birth workers and people that are working directly with clients and in clients' homes and doing kind of continuity of care, such as we do as doulas, that, and birth workers more broadly, that hopefully our voices can be viewed as something critical in this critical dialogue, because I think that they're valuable. I certainly feel like I know more about infant sleep safety than the dude bra who invented the owlet, or maybe even Harvey Karp. So kind of trying to get over some of this imposter syndrome stuff and move through my writing, because I hear from all of you a lot, and I hear about how frustrating the technologies are in our work. That was the slide that's supposed to be up. I also want to mention that I'm doing this presentation as a bit of, I'm coming in with some understanding that there's some inherent bias that we all have here, which is to our benefit, right? If most of us are birth workers or in the reproductive health space, that we're coming into the discussions around technologies and birth and pregnancy and reproductive technologies with a certain set of biases that are beneficial to this conversation, but that also I want to spend this time to talk about some bigger kind of meta discussions, I think, because I'm already, from talking to so many of you already, that I don't think I have to try and plead this case that bodies are relevant, that the mind and body are not separate, that we need to think about being critical around technology because of what it represents in terms of bodily and reproductive autonomy, that we probably don't want these sorts of technologies to be further ingrained in these parenting and reproductive spaces, in part because we're not trying to promote the continuation of like a patriarchal system or things that have racial, class, and gender sexuality bias built into them, that I don't think that most of us probably wish to further surveillance capitalism or contribute to the furthering of a carceral state. I also don't think that most of us probably want to turn a blind eye to how technology is contributing to climate change and the structures inherent there in sort of resource extraction. And so I might spend more time talking about like data extraction and versus a bit about the ecological extraction, though there's episodes of my podcast about that and I write about that more. So I want to take this time to explore a few of these other dialogues around like techno-determinism and techno-utopianism and these sorts of things, and how these emerging and existing technologies kind of contribute to the snowball effect that's already happening in our culture. So I just want to say that to be like, I'm not ignoring the fact that we could go on, and I do, and try and do it a lot in my writing about the value of bodies and humans and the parenting experience, and the spiritual experience of birthing and all of these sorts of things. And so, yeah, don't at me if I seem to be leaving those out. They're definitely there, and I those are the sorts of things that tend to be really valuable that come up in kind of the Q&As and your input too. So I look forward to those. So on that note, the main objectives I have for this presentation are in part to do a little bit of defining of technologies. So what does it mean to talk about technologies in the reproductive space? And I'm going to focus a bit more on postpartum technologies. And I'll get into why that is, but it is part of a continuum. And so I will be talking about sort of repro tech more broadly. And I want to define a little bit about what a technology is and give a little bit of history there. I'm going to keep mentioning this one researcher. His name is Anil Dash, and he is he's someone within the tech world. He runs a tech company. He's very entrenched in it, and he wrote this great article called 12 Things Everyone Should Understand About Technology. And one of the 12 things on that list is that a lot of tech is ahistorical. And when I look at reproductive technologies and what's being put into some of these emerging consumer technologies, it's very clear to me as a birth worker who has also been a researcher, who's done midwifery studies, who's been doing this for over a decade, that these technologies are deeply ahistorical. They are not addressing the systemic problems that have existed. They're further entrenching them, but talking as though they're being disruptors in the space, and that they're creating this thing and that they're finally going to save all the babies, but that's what the rhetoric has been forever, since male, quote unquote, male midwives were coming around inventing forceps, or supposedly, someone somewhere probably invented forceps before those dude bras in the 1700s, but that's the myth making of that. So get a little bit into the history to make sense of where we are and why it's still a problem. And then I want to go into how these technologies impact us as birth workers specifically. Hopefully I will get a chance to get to the point where I'm talking about sort of ambient tech as well, in terms of not just the consumer products that we're interfacing with our clients, but also I think, or I know that things like social media and things, classes and workshops and things switching virtual, being asked to do more virtual caretaking in terms of, joining these maternity apps and switching our jobs to be more virtual, as well as our whole world having this constant connection and all the constant connection apps, how as birth workers, a lot of times our job is being accessible, and how that's taken to a new extreme now because our clients are made to, with their work and their lives, be constantly connected, and there's an addiction factor as well. They expect that of us, and how that's shaping our roles and expectations as well. So hopefully I can get into that. And then I want to try, I'm not like a very positive mental attitude person, but I would really like to try and end somewhere that doesn't feel entirely cynical, but that will certainly be a challenge for me with this topic, but I will try. So those are my main objectives here. I like this quote from Wendell Berry, which was written in his book, Why I Won't Buy a Computer, in 1990. He writes, "When somebody has used a computer to write work that is demonstrably better than Dante's, and when this better is demonstrably attributable to the use of a computer, then I will speak of computers with a more respectful tone of voice, though I still will not buy one." For me, I read all of this technology stuff with this filter of what about baby tech? What about baby tech? This quote stood out to me in terms of, as doulas, especially those of us who have been working for a little while, or those of us who have worked maybe in different environments, so outside of the US or outside of the Bay Area bubble, or outside of kind of upper middle class white spaces where most of this technology is being used for experimentation, or being marketed towards those folks as consumers. Having this ability and this perspective to go, are these devices tools that are bettering the experience of the childbearing year for folks? Are they actually increasing options and access and confidence and care, or are they simply just tech? Are they simply just there and we're supposed to accept them, or parents are supposed to feel that they are valuable, or are they actually creating an experience that's demonstrably better than parenting was for our parents or our grandparents? And I think that for many of us, we're mostly feeling like not only do we not think that parenting has become demonstrably easier or better or gooder, parents are more good, babies are becoming good babies now because of tech, but that we're actually experiencing some significant detriments that are happening. And there are various instances why, but I wanted to use this quote as sort of a foundational element of how we can start to process some of the questions that we have and the critiques that we have around the technologies. And having said that, to not be completely cynical, there are examples where the technology is helping. I'm not anti-science, I'm not anti-technology. I think things like the Earth app are incredible. The Earth app is very thoughtfully done. It is actually filling a gap and a need. It has some safety nets and components to it that are thoughtful and protective, and that's important. I think they're open to dialogue, and that it could be a greater good. And hopefully it's one of those things also that is a tool that helps improve the lives of many people to the point where it's not needed anymore. Same with something like, a hands-free lactation pump. There are certainly areas where that can be a good, I'm totally down for, like, we can give the Nobel Prize to whoever makes one that's good and works and it doesn't make people's nipples bleed, that's fine. There's some great things that can happen in that space. But unfortunately, there are sort of these techno-determinist meta structures that make it so that even something that could be a good or actually is addressing a problem doesn't make the situation better and maybe has some trade-offs that are worse, making things worse. And so how can we have that perspective and how can we communicate that situation to the folks that we work with and just people generally in our lives who are experiencing pregnancy and parenting? So as a start to define technologies a little bit, this is going to get a little wonky, but I think that for those of us who would consider ourselves kind of radical doulas or in this framework of trying to dismantle systemic problems, that it's worth defining technology a little bit more deeply. So first off, not all tech is digital. In our common language, we think about tech as being a gadget. And that's not even just to say there's like colloquial terminology around software and hardware. And we all know what that is, right? Like, so social media is a software, our word processors are software. I made this on Canva, it's a software. And then hardware is our computer, our phone, the actual snoo, the Toco device, things like that are hard technologies. And then there are technologies that are hard and soft that aren't necessarily digital. So a hard technology that's not digital is, a bottle. They didn't always exist. A crib itself is about, the way we think about a crib is about 100 years old. That was a technology, and a hard technology. And then soft technologies, and I'm using this terminology from a professor and researcher, Joshua Fairfield, who writes a lot about technology and legal structures. He talks about soft technology as being any sort of tool and system that creates cultural change in a broader sense. So law is a technology. Our government structures are a technology. So even something like our Constitution is a technology. That way we can change and morph and grow language to communicate with each other is a tool, and therefore it's a technology, and it's a technology that can change. And so when we are talking about reproductive tech and birth and parenting tech and all of that, I do think it's really important that we have both the mindset of the hard tech of the device and the soft tech of the applications and how they interact with each other. And then also the hard technologies of the applied science, right? So these things that we easily can think of as being tech, and the soft technologies in terms of the broader structural circumstances and the cultural circumstances that bring these technologies forward or help to perhaps stop certain technologies from going too far. So one of his books is called Runaway Technology, and it's about legal structures keeping up with the kind of applied scientific technology. And it's a super wonky book, but it's been super fascinating. And I've been surprised to see that even in that book, there's only one instance of, I know it's actually his other book, about baby monitors being hacked and what to do about that. But there are stories out there of, I was just reading one today about the snoo getting hacked, and baby monitors getting hacked. There's plenty of cases around that. There's lots of people that have had sex toys hacked. So we need the soft technologies of our laws to catch up to some of these systems. And if any of you have been following along with the Facebook whistleblower circumstance that, or like have heard of something called 230, that we're way behind. And a lot of these tech companies are pulling the wool over our eyes in terms of being not allowing us, they're like very much gaslighting us into not being able to define them properly so that they can't be regulated. And there are significant instances of that happening within the reproductive tech space. And a lot of that, and I'm sure any of you who have been, especially a birth doula, understand that these structures come a lot from this idea of who is allowed, who's saving people, who's allowed to be present at a space, what is allowed, this idea of hoodwinking and manipulating. And again, it's really easy to push things through when you have this promise in our country with personhood laws and restrictive access to reproductive choice, to say, but all of this is in the service of saving babies. So I think a lot of us are very prone, especially when we're talking about baby tech, to focus a lot on this idea of productivity, especially for those of us working in the Bay Area, because we feel that and hear that from our clients all the time. I think a lot of us that are focusing in on conversations around capitalism, that the productivity conversation is there. It's like right on the surface. And then there's also this other narrative that's been so deeply entrenched within the reproductive space about saving babies, and how we really need to focus on how compelling that is. And it's compelling for lawmakers and researchers and also people creating these technologies. And so, and I mean, I'll say too, to be quite honest, sometimes it's really hard when I'm doing this research to tiptoe into the marketing for some of these devices and some of these software programs, because it's so alluring. And it's a lot of magical thinking, and I know better, but their ability to kind of straddle, they must have phenomenal lawyers, that's all I gotta say, is to be able to say that they're not medical, they can't say that they're medical devices, but then to claim life-saving abilities in medicine. And this is just a big, broad discussion in kind of telemedicine in general. And we'll be hearing a lot more about that as Amazon and Apple and other places now are moving with their wearable tech, moving into privatized medicine as well. That it's really hard for me to listen to those warnings and go, but they're already doing it to babies. Like they've been doing it in birth, they've been doing it in pregnancy, and now they're doing it to babies. And it has been these things have been on the consumer marketplace for a long time, especially when we consider that choosing to give birth in a hospital versus outside of the hospital is also a consumer choice, because insurance doesn't cover a lot of care outside of the hospital, but within privatized insurance, some people do get to move around and to make choices around care providers and things like that. And so this has been going on for a long time, and I think most of us probably have more familiarity with some of the critical discussions around both soft technologies and hard technologies than we might even be totally aware of. So I hope when I'm talking about these things, there's a lot of light bulbs going off, being like, oh yeah, I know about that. Because I think as doulas, we've been having a bit of a unique position in our spaces to be able for these things to feel familiar. Unfortunately, I wish that I could just ignore them, but I cannot. All right, so let's go into some examples. So I'm curious to know if anyone has ever heard of ectogenesis or artificial wombs yet. It's kind of the more extreme end of the situation, but anyway, I guess a lot of people don't have their cameras on, but where we get the most extreme version of kind of hard reproductive technologies is that there is such a thing as ectogenesis. If you think about, if you've ever seen The Matrix, you know, the wall of people floating in these like tanks, so their actual bodies are floating in tanks while they're off living, you know, in the Matrix. That is a bit of reality that exists right now. They haven't yet put a human fetus in an artificial womb. And it's either called ectogenesis, artificial womb, or it's also sometimes called a biobag. But it is technology that exists that they've grown a premature lamb fetus into a lamb that could exist outside of this biobag fully. So that's a interesting extreme case, and there are some very strange conversations around it. And part of what makes ectogenesis really fascinating to research, and I highly suggest the book Sex, Robots, and Vegan Meats by Jenny Kleeman. She's hilarious, and ectogenesis is one of the things that she writes about. And it's one of those things in technology, in tech spaces, because there is this ideology that's very libertarian, that seems to have a lot of intersection of people that would seem to be at opposite ends of the spectrum, and maybe ideologically have a different reason for why, but overlap in terms of the how. And so in terms of artificial wombs, they're championed by people that say that it's the most ultimate expression of feminism to be able to remove birth from the traditional realm of female bodies. That also can get into, there are folks who are trans allies who promote ectogenesis. So it's kind of a niche thing, and it's in Jenny Kleeman's book. She interviews a trans woman, and lets her speak in a letter form, and it's really fascinating and beautiful conversation around birth and birthing bodies. I think it also is championed by anti-choice advocates as being a way to rescue fetuses from bad mothers who would otherwise terminate their pregnancies. So it's an interesting space to get into around techno-determinism. And I think it's one of those places, and this happens so much with reproductive health, as we're all very aware, that everyone seems to have a very strong opinion, and that these opinions start to intersect in very strange ways. So the experiments going on right now around ectogenesis are happening at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, my hometown. And it's very interesting to hear about that. And it's kind of interesting in the few circumstances where they're kind of talking about that, and kind of a crossover with some of the CRISPR research and the gene editing research that's happening over here in Berkeley as well. Some other things that we might have a bit more familiarity with, and that also aren't quite so like sci-fi, high tech, far away from us right now, are things like infant sleep trackers, which take multiple different forms. They're sometimes sort of sneakily disguised as being about safety primarily. And I'm going to get into that more, that kind of, what are you really? Like, are you actually promoting infant sleep? Are you actually a medical device? Are you actually a way to sell sleep training programs? Like, what does that mean? But I'm sure any of us working with new parents have been exposed to some sleep tracker of some form, whether it be something that has like an actual monitored device or something that's just an app. Smart cribs. So the origin there is, we're kind of sleeping or we had babies sleeping in hammock sort of looking contraptions, or in boxes on the floor, in bed with parents, etc. There were lots of different iterations depending on culture and class and space in terms of where babies slept. And then a little over 100 years ago, the crib, kind of as we know it, is, you know, a separate little unit, a bassinet, and then later something with slatted sides was invented. Not that long after the crib was invented, the Skinner box was created. So some of you might know that expression, Skinner was the inventor, and that is very similar to the NICU units that we might think of, where you can kind of put your arms in, and it was designed primarily for premature babies. And no one, I have an article up about this around the origins of smart cribs that talks about this up on my Patreon, that goes into the history in depth, but Skinner couldn't get any hospitals to take him seriously. So instead he was showing these at Coney Island, and he was 28 babies or so that traveled around in these Skinner boxes around to different like World's Fairs and freak shows and things. So anyway, that's like our origin of the smart crib is Coney Island freak show. So kind of strange and ironic in a way. And then so cribs got kind of more high tech, and then they started going back a little bit and back to bassinets and baskets and things like that. And now we're seeing in the past maybe 15 years or so, because I didn't see them that much when I first started off. They were kind of slowly making their way over. They were more common in Europe than not, but these side sleepers, which I'm sure a lot of us have seen, you know, like the arms reach and whatever. And then of course in the US, they're not flush with the mattress. They have to be 4 inches down and whatever. So they keep being reinvented further in various ways because of laws and fear and liability and things like that. And then from there, now we're going back into these more independent sleep spaces that are the smart cribs, that are designed to be marketed for safety's sake, but moved further and further away from parents all the time. But then with this constant connectivity, right? So you can't, it's the most dangerous thing in the world to have your baby be close to you. The closer, the more dangerous. But have your baby in this bed and then be able to watch it all night from afar is kind of this weird conflicting message that parents were getting all the time about what is safe and what is not safe. We'll get into that a little bit more too. Of course, there's lactation pumps. And so they're increasingly becoming more digitized. So it's not just that the technology exists, that it's like a piece of equipment that plugs into a wall and uses electricity. But now several of the pumps increasingly can't be operated unless there is an app controlling it. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's happening. It's definitely not for convenience or because it makes the pumps work better somehow. Then there's maternity apps or pregnancy apps, fertility apps, things like that. And they're being used for various purposes. They're used as parental education, yes and no, for social media or social connection, and then increasingly for telemedicine. And that is something that has definitely been on the rise thanks to COVID and will probably be here to stay in some capacity. And it's worth us being critical about the fact that most people will see, if they're going through traditional obstetrical care, they were already seeing an obstetrician probably, it was under 3 hours through the course of their pregnancy. And now with telemedicine, yeah, they don't have to go to an office and waste their time waiting for an hour to see their care provider for about 5 minutes. But now there's the potential to see and interact with a care provider even less, because it's increasingly becoming that, oh, you have your chart. It's very empowering that you have your chart. So why do I need to see you more? Oh, we can send your heart rate monitor to your home. That's very empowering. We don't have to see you anymore. So this very low contact, like low physical contact low personalized contact experience that most people were having through pregnancy and even conception onward is becoming even more abstract, removed through the process of telemedicine and digitization, but being promoted and marketed as being hyper-connected, hyper-empowered, hyper-informed care. So it's interesting because I think that there are definitely, again, avenues for telemedicine to be really actually empowering and informative and increase access, but it's without addressing the systemic problems that we have in pregnancy care. It's not going to get better. We're just further ingraining that. And then, you know, never mind all the issues we have with privatized healthcare and access and racial bias and all that kind of stuff. It's very unlikely that, I mean, it's definitely not going to be automatically solved because of technology. So we have to remain critical. There's birth tech as well. And so those are lots of things that we have seen and been exposed to before as birth workers. So we think about the ultrasound, which now there's 3D ultrasounds. There's ultrasounds that get automatically uploaded and downloaded and whatever. So there's like further layers of tech mediation. There's operative tech. So again, going back to the early days of the forceps and the kind of shoehorny situations, and then all the technology that's involved in operative deliveries, belly births, cesareans. There's the TOCO devices, or think the belly bands and the monitoring through birth, and the electric fetal monitoring, both internal and external monitoring systems, and also digital charting. So even if you had a very low intervention birth in whatever birth setting, it's becoming increasingly more common that your care provider is either sitting there with a computer on their lap, typing and charting, and your conversations are mediated through that kind of telemedicine, or someone is standing there, usually a nurse, and they're click-clacking away at a computer throughout your laboring experience. I forgot to mention with the reproductive telehealth also that a lot of these emerging technologies are private startups. And so I mentioned Clio, there's 7 Starling, there's Tia, there's, I don't know, a bunch of weird ones that Goop keeps promoting. And when it's on Goop, we just gotta snarl and, I don't know, try and bury ourselves or run far away from the closest anthropology or whatever. But now, and increasingly, as I've mentioned before, as reproductive care persons, we're expected to be participating more in this telehealth, and the jobs that are out there for us a lot of times, if we are trying to escape burnout, we're trying to move horizontally, or if we're thinking about our work in terms of access and opportunity, we're also increasingly being expected to participate in these emerging technologies. So we're going to be battling on one hand these cultural understandings of technology and of birth through private startups, as well as the stuff that's not being dismantled and actually disrupted and broken within our obstetrical care system. So now we're fighting a battle on multiple fronts. And then on top of that is doulas ourselves. When I'm talking to doulas about these technologies, we're also arguing with each other over whether or not that's valid work, or if there's such thing as being like, I consider being a Trojan horse. So working for some of these companies so that they don't go off the deep end and make things worse. And there's doulas who completely disagree with that. And there's all sorts of levels. So it's, not making our jobs any easier. I'll definitely say that. And then there's the social networks for parents. And it's like, I can't stand Facebook, but in doing this research, I've been spending time on these new parenting groups and stuff like that. And it's a scary place. The mommy wars are up and raging, and there's so many new dimensions and elements to that as well, around technology and cultural shifts and our language shifts and things like that. And it's kind of a dark, scary place. And then I'm not going to go into as much detail about these sort of things, but these constitute what we would call the socio-technical examples, or the soft technology. And those are birth language, cultural representation. So on my podcast, I spend time talking to doulas about birth scenes in movies and TV shows. Sarah was on. We talked about that horrible movie, What to Expect When You're Expecting. It's like almost as bad as the book, but it's boring. Can't even get that mad at it. Anyway, so you should listen to that. There's the popular blogs. I'm sure lots of us have experienced clients coming to us being like, I read on Kelly's mom that, or if you're connected, more and more they're connected to these apps, then have internal blogs and things like that they're being constantly fed. The Wonder Weeks blog and the sleep training blogs and all these sorts of things. So those are sort of soft technologies because they're shaping the whole understanding and shaping policy and shaping consumer culture and things like that. So they're worth being made aware of. Doulas ourselves, so we're social tech or socio-technical solutions to a problem. We are a tool in a way, and we have been integrated into the cultural landscape here because birth is broken in the United States, and we are supposed to be able to help fix it. And so doulas as a profession are technological changes under this definition. Then there's maternal health policy. I don't know how many of you saw that the mommy bus bill was passed today. So that's a bit of social tech. And I know doulas have very strong feelings across the board about doula legislation, and also just generally how maternal health care policy is being written, what's being focused on. There are social rituals. I'm going to get a little bit into that, talking about the Robbie Davis-Floyd's definition of the technocratic model. Partner and family. So our communities and social spaces are also can be bits of soft technology. So how the definition of parent is changing and roles are changing. And then again, this can be an understanding of some tech actually increasing access and understanding and community building there, and sort of the social landscape. There's the obstetrical professions. So this understanding, and this is going to, I think, become a really big part of what comes out of a further push around the hard and digital technologies as well, is this going to further entrench us into a highly technological obstetrical landscape? So as this moves forward, and people who work as clinical care providers, how much more are they going to have to adapt to using these technologies? They already have. I mean, think that, there's plenty of OBs who are never taught how to do palpation to understand the positioning of a baby because ultrasounds exist. And then the ultrasounds kept getting smaller and smaller, and so they can be wheeled in and used. And we have Dopplers to replace some of the tocos. And then it's all of this, where they have decided that even though the evidence points strongly against routine monitoring, that now the mission has to be that we have to make the monitors smaller and smaller so that we can stick them on and walk away further and make it even more constant contact. And what does that do? Then feeding backward into who gets to be trained in how to use them, who has access to use them, and then the cycle keeps repeating itself. And then going back to this idea again of the original dismantling of midwifery throughout the ages, is who gets to be the one to say that I understand tech, that I am a person of science. It's not come out for midwives, that's been the big conspiracy theory of Western obstetrics, is that women and women of color are not able or capable of utilizing technology. And there's been like weird half-assed sort of fake attempts of saying, no, we're not like that anymore. Look, there are more women in medical school finishing with obstetrics than men now. And, we're not outrightly saying that women of color can't go to medical school, but, how much is that really happening when we think about the larger systemic problems of who gets hired, who gets loans, who has access to the understanding, and if we're just further making more tech on top of tech on top of tech, and the idea is that only like rich white men can create tech, they're the only ones getting funding, they're the only ones with companies going private, then it's just like, sorry, I'm rambling, but it's a big mess that I think birth workers have been seeing for a long time and fed up with for a long time, and it's not getting better the more technology that gets introduced into the space. So we need to focus on some of these like soft tech cultural issues as we pay attention to the hard technologies that are being pushed forward. And then lastly, a birth space is a technology too. So creating these like birthing centers within hospitals is a bit of tech, again, used to gaslight and hoodwink people. But even things that are becoming more mobilized tech to expand this idea of the technocratic model of birth into spaces outside of the hospital as well. And so that's starting to shift more and more there. So sorry, that was a lot, but. So many of you have probably been exposed to the idea of something called the technocratic model of birth. That is a term that's been coined by the researcher Robbie Davis-Floyd. I realize this is backward. She wrote the book Birth as American Rite of Passage. But you can also find her articles on the different models of birth on her website. They're all, there's lots of this information out, open access. It's pretty wonky stuff, so I'm going to try and break it down in a way that doesn't sound as much like it was written by a brilliant anthropology professor, but basically it's this idea of technocracy and techno-determinism in the birthing space. And so she was noting this, back in the mid 80s, and she was interviewing people who had experienced pregnancy and childbirth, most of them through the traditional American obstetrical model, a few of them through home birthing. And she was getting their take on what they felt about the myth of like the supremacy of technology in birthing spaces. And of course, the home birth women were saying like, we're removing ourselves from the technocratic model intentionally. And then there was a range of beliefs and understandings and ritual making within the other folks who are pregnant, who are going through the traditional hospital route. And so it's very interesting to hear. There's a lot of firsthand accounts and quotes and dialogue in all of her writing. Again, as an anthropologist, she's very good about bringing in actual voices and communication in that space. And then she also talks to midwives and doctors and nurses and folks as well. But it's important to, I think, understand the technocratic model. I mean, again, I think a lot of you have probably read some of this. I have, in my 12 years and going through multiple trainings, her work on the technocratic model has been given to me in a lot of ways. So sorry if this is repetitive. But, 1980, so that's, as old as me, 35, 36 years ago, this was a problem, and it's becoming worse for a lot of us. That a lot of the birthing experience is increasingly mediated by technology. So there are very few folks who, especially in the US, the UK, like Western Europe, Canada, there are very few persons who are going to have any bit of their experience from conception through early parenting that didn't involve quite a bit of technologies. And so we're thinking about assisted reproductive technologies. So those are on the rise. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that particular market is on the rise and a little bit of why, but I'm not going to focus on that too much because it's like a whole complex can of worms there. But I'm sure, especially for those of us who have been working in the Bay Area for a while, that we have probably seen a pretty large spike in the amount of people who are conceiving through technological assistance in some way. And I'm not making a value judgment on that, it's just a reality. I think also that these sort of broader understandings of that tech is ambient, that it's inevitable, that it's a part of our lives, that there is, and we read about like any kind of market share with baby tech and stuff like that, everyone's like, millennials are so connected. They want to be able to have everything connected in some sort of smart device. So of course they want their pregnancy, birthing, and parenting experiences also mediated through technology. And it's this understanding that there is a more universal idea that tech is good. And that of course, if we want higher tech food delivery service, that we definitely want our babies to be also delivered through a high tech experience. And the thing with the technocratic model is that Robbie Davis is so amazing at pointing out is all of this ritual making is very top down. There is this idea that there is techno supremacy, and then it trickles down through a lot of fear, through a lot of rituals, through this understanding that as long as you keep saying it's the best and there is no other way, like it's completely a conspiracy theory that if you keep saying it is this way, it has to be this way, here is proof of why, that then when the consumers of that space or the participants in that space that are, birthing people, that they go in and are like, well, okay, this is the only way, that then the top down, like, look, see that these people want it. And that was the argument for a long time in the early 2000s about when they were talking about reducing the cesarean rate, was that people keep turning it back to be like, well, all these women are demanding it. It's this maternal request. How can we deny them this choice? It's ultimate choice. And then of course, it turns out that it was a way more complex situation than that. And so I think that for those of us who are experiencing a lot of this technology, especially in the parenting space, that they've been told through their whole conception and pregnancy that they couldn't do it on their own. Their body isn't good enough. They'll never know what to do without it. They can never trust their intuition. Something like the quickening is not valid until it's shown, the baby is shown on an ultrasound, or the fetus, that they can't say, I'm sure I'm pregnant. I know my body, without it being confirmed through technology and onward through the whole experience. That then to come out of that experience and go, oh yeah, my body can totally produce enough milk to feed and sustain this person. I can just trust that. Oh yeah, I can totally trust that I'm going to be able to get my baby to sleep. Oh yeah, definitely I know what's safe for my baby. I mean, come on, like it's just very unlikely. And the more tech we throw into it, and the more tech that spits out how you need to be biohacking your body and biohacking your baby to make the devices work better, the less confidence that they're going to have. And then we just have to have more tech and more tech and more tech on top of it. And so that's kind of the technocratic model 2.0. And so some of the fundamentals of that's driving that narrative is, first, the technocratic model sees the body as a machine. And increasingly, the brain is a computer, the body is a computer. We hear a lot of that stuff kind of ambiently, especially around wearable tech. It's this idea of how we have all these analogies that now are really fluid. So like computers are like brains and brains are like computers. But originally, Robbie Davis-Floyd was saying, why is a birthing woman like a broken down car? Is one of the intros to one of her articles. So it's this idea that inherently, and again, this was written in 1985, so birthing people, but it is someone who embodies a body with a womb is inherently cyclical, has cyclical rhythms to their body, and the ideal is a smooth, straight line machine, like a car, or like something, a clock you can go in and like tinker with, and it's very linear. That is the ideal that comes out of industrialism and Enlightenment ideas about the body, and get really wonky with like Descartes and the mind-body separation and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, someone who's pregnant is experiencing a deviation from the normal, and a doctor as a technician should be able to diagnose the problem, like you would diagnose, if your spark plugs were the thing that was making the engine not work. Look at me talking about cars, like I know anything about cars. But you can go in and like find the diagnosis, you can twist and bonk and like turn a few screws, and then you can put some oil in it, and then it's going to run and be fixed. And all of that is growth, progress, everything still has to be then on a linear path. So you are pregnant and you go down this linear experience till the baby comes out. And then your baby goes through these linear milestones to become an independent human being. And those of us who have been working in this space for a long time know that that's rarely the real experience of birth, that it's way more organic and mutable and liminal and changing. And then as we get into these ideas of the realities of non-binary experiences and different familial structures and traumas that live within the body and all these sorts of things, we get further and further and further and further away from this linear machine body. But that doesn't work in technocracy. So all of that is a problem, and all of that has a technical solution. End of story. Within the technocratic model too, there's quantifiable realities. So everything is able to be data extracted and measured, and anything that is not able to be pulled in a quantifiable space is not relevant. So intuition, subjective experiences, choice, those sorts of things are just not relevant in the technocratic model, which is really interesting. And Davis-Floyd and other people do a really great job of talking about this. And I think some of my favorite tech writers talk about this too, is this idea that there's like a lot of legit opinion-based magical thinking in technocratic models. But as positioning themselves as doctors, positioning themselves as technicians, as people learned of science and whatever, that somehow there's just no magical thinking in that. And what they are saying is not opinion, which we know is certifiably soft or wrong. And we also know that there's legitimate, actual quantifiable science that says that obstetricians use their opinions more than high-level evidence to make decisions 2/3 of the time anyway. So this whole myth-making craziness. And also to say that the pregnant person, even if they're saying that they've been able to quantify things and extract data from themselves, that it's not good enough. It doesn't count, right? Unless it can be measured, it doesn't count. control and separation are huge in the technocratic model. So who has control? Technicians and doctors. I'm realizing that I'm like taking up way too much space, so I'm going to run through this a little bit more quickly. And then of course something that we might be seeing more and more, and something that I think really irks birth workers, is the separation component. And so in terms of like mind and body being separate, fetus and gestational person being separate, that once the baby is born, that they have to become independent and separate immediately, that separate is good, separate is progress. And so let's see how is the technocratic model doing in the markets? Really well. So here's some market shares. I wanted to show a video, but I'll just have to share it with everyone on the founder of the outlet when they went public.
No, please share that video. Well, I mean, you don't have to, but I watched it and it was like so messed up.
Yeah, I will share it in the chat during the Q&A, but it's definitely worthwhile. It's 5 minutes long, and it is, if you want to see extreme technocratic model in baby tech, listen to this super dude bra talk about the outlet ecosystem. It's fascinating and creepy. So you can see the market shares here of the different reproductive, femtech, and pregnancy and baby tech. I will say that doing this research, it's really interesting that a lot of the conversations and articles are obviously not written by people who have any experience in these sectors. So trying to parse out what counts as what to get some kind of truth into how much money is going into these spaces, I find a little bit hard. And that's something that I'm going to have to spend a lot more time while I'm writing my book. But anyway, you can see that these numbers are pretty dang huge. Anyway, it's a lot of money. It's not niche. So there's this is a quote from Kurt Workman, who is the founder of Outlet, that I thought was really interesting. We started the company because I was concerned, says Workman. My wife had 3 heart surgeries, and as a baby, they didn't catch it. They sent her home from the hospital thinking everything was okay. Then her mom, miraculously, 10 days later, had a feeling that something was wrong. She walked into the baby's room and found her not breathing. They rushed her to the hospital and then did open heart surgery to save her life. So this is the reason, he says, why he created a device that would monitor and track, otherwise, as far as everybody knows, completely healthy babies. And the goal of Outlet is to have as many babies as humanly possible connected here. So never mind the fact that in that story, his wife's mother, with her intuition, her motherly intuition, noticed something was wrong and did what she needed to do. And then she got the care that was needed. And that the problem here is in part that they didn't catch it because probably the industrialized fast track birthing obstetrical model in the hospital was not more aware, more in tune to check for these things. But never mind that it seems like a happy story. What needs to happen there is that technology should have saved her. And if only everybody had this technology, all these parents would be saving all of these babies. And that's not to say that, these heart defects, they are a big risk factor in infancy. It's 1% of births every year that there's infant mortality because of these heart conditions that either don't get caught or aren't treated well, so on and so forth. But I think that as an example of this idea that tech will solve this, when there's obviously much, much greater systemic issues there, and also just like the natural order of things, is very compelling to a lot of people. And they came up with a lot of money to be able to get that. I wish, whatever, I don't need to teach you guys about SPACs anyway. I was kind of dreading that, so I'll make that an article. But why the outlet was able to get publicly traded so fast, and why that's the first one is a bit of a fascinating story as well, and says a lot about where we're going with baby tech. Relevant to us is a bit about this idea, again, that humans can't be the best possible parent, or they certainly can't do it alone. Again, it had to be mediated by doctors and technology through the whole reproductive experience. And now that the baby is out, it needs to be watched over by these loving robots in society and dude programmers somewhere in Silicon Valley or Utah, or more likely with the data extraction somewhere in India, actually mediating the amount of the data coming through and navigating those things. So again, I talked a little about completely human-free birth with ectogenesis, and a bit about, you can have a pretty start to finish technological birthing and parenting experience and have nothing sort of come from intuition, or nothing free of tech. You can have every step of the process technologically driven. And then also this idea that in this, I'm not going to get into like transhumanism a whole bunch and bore you all with that, but this idea that since everything, for AI to work and for this techno-utopianism to work, everybody and everything needs to be constantly connected. So of course, babies and infants must be part of that. It is this idea that it's good for all of us, it's good for humanity, it'll make things better. And when you watch that video with Kurt Workman, he's like, it's a very extreme example of that ideology, that we have to have every baby connected so we can better the world, not just to save their lives. The data is really important. Then there's also this idea that we need technologies because parents are inherently flawed and bad. So in technological conversations, this idea of human error comes up a lot. So this again goes a bit into magical thinking, where it's this idea that humans can create technology that's free of human error to fix human problems. It becomes this like really bizarre black hole of logic that's really fascinating to me. And there's some very interesting cultural commentators talking about this. And yeah, and I never see that discussed more broadly or in opinion pieces at all about birth and pregnancy and baby technology. And I think for most of us, that's the most apparent thing, that when we're looking at a lot of these technologies, they're being built on things that are fundamentally wrong assumptions about human bodies and the way babies work. And it is extremely frustrating to have to interact with parents who are observing what is happening and going through these experiences and going, but the bed says it's wrong, so it's wrong. It's like, how do I make my body and my baby work better so that this expensive gadget works better? Because the bed has to be right and I have to be fundamentally wrong. And it is not coming from their own brains. It's coming from the soft technologies of culture and obstetrics and things like that. And then we get this idea that parents are inherently also dumb and wrong and don't know what they're doing. And so there needs to be these like re-education programs about how to be a person and a human and how humans interact with each other, mediated by tech. So if you think about with the SNU to an extent, or the language that they use, LV even, that they're using this idea of like warm embrace and cuddly parenting, or the night lights now that parents can record their voice. So when the parent or the baby wakes up in the middle of the night, in order to keep them independent and like sleeping through the night and self-soothing, they can listen to the parent's voice through the little gadget, the nightlight. But it would be wrong. Parents are wrong and they're creating bad habits and they're doing dumb stuff that's going to hurt the child forever if they go in there in person and do it. So it's a whole lot. And it's very frustrating as a birth worker to hear these things all the time. Right, another quote. What makes us most human is what is least computable about us. The connections between our mind and body, the experiences that shape our memory and our thinking, our capacity for emotion and empathy. The great danger we face as we become more intimately involved with our computers, as we've come to experience more of our lives through the disembodied symbols flickering across their screens, is that we'll begin to lose our humanness, to sacrifice the very qualities that separate us from machines. That is a quote from Nicholas Carr in The Shallows. I highly recommend that book. But I think that is something that probably resonates with a lot of us in this space, helping our clients deal with techno-determinism. So this is something we can save it for the full Q&A, but I think another thing that's coming up a lot is this idea that all data is neutral. So it's there, extract as much of it as you can. We need to know every single possible thing we could possibly know about the life of a person going through the day. And we need everybody, almost 8 billion of us, to be connected, because it's just the more data, the better. Or this idea that all data is good. So those of us who have kind of interacted a bit with Emily Ooster's books, which I like in a lot of ways, and I think that there's like a space for it, but it's interesting, and I have to remind parents of this all the time, that she says multiple times that there is no such thing as bad data. You can never, like, all information is good, all research contributes to something, and the more data that's collected, the more we can know, but that's, maybe not necessarily true. And then whether or not tech is inevitable. So it's not this thing of like, everything's probably not going to collapse and we're going to go back to living in caves. But this idea, more nuanced, is that just because a bit of technology was invented, it's here to stay. And so that's something that I think is very relevant. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that in terms of baby tech. But I'll try and speed through these next couple of things, because I really want to have a full Q&A. A lot of this is about control. Again, going back to the technocratic model, is who is in control? I mean, who's in control of the data? Once it's extracted from us, does it still belong to us? Is it still ours? What about our stories and the stories of parents here? When it becomes something quantifiable, is it still ours? Is it still our story? And then who gets to define that? Who gets to say what tech is good? Who gets to say what data is worth exploring and worth collecting? And there's a giant meta problem with that within our culture. And then there's also on the individual one-on-one basis, it's each parent is being told that they have infinite choice in this experience of parenting. But do they? Like, how much control do they actually have over this experience? And as all of this stuff is being fed to them as being empowered and about well-being and development, is it, who is it really? And how much of it is that choice? If it's feeding back this information using these like behavioral modification tools that are saying, if your baby doesn't do this by this, you are bad, do something. Like, how much control and how much empowerment is actually there on that individual level? And then because there's the data extraction and the consumerism and the social media element of it, this all gets fed back into this like ever churning giant meta narrative that, to be entirely cynical, makes Mark Zuckerberg rich and Harvey Karp. Like, it's not actually helping. Babies aren't getting smarter. It's just, or whatever, parents aren't having an easier experience. Babies aren't getting smarter. Fewer babies are not dying. Like, we have spikes in whatever, you all know that I don't have to go that deep into our statistics there, you guys. I trust that you all know that, and that's partly why you're here. So it's this idea of surveillance capitalism, and I highly suggest that you go on and learn a bit about Shoshana Zuboff's research. Sorry, Hugo has a lot to say about it. Also, like the social dilemma talks about this a bit, about the creation of us as, we're called users. So again, this is something that's kind of, I don't have to go into detail about this too much because we're all pretty aware of this now, I think, as consumers and participants and users in technology in our own personal lives. But as it relates to parents a bit specifically, is that it was shown that a pregnant person's views, we live in an attention economy, and a pregnant person's views on a bit of advertisement is worth 15 times more than a non-pregnant person or non-parent. So while you might be scrolling through something and an advertisement can go through that would cost an advertiser about 10 cents for you to spend a second or a second and a half on it on average, that second and a half, if it was a pregnant person, and of course, because of algorithms and surveillance tech, they can tell when you're pregnant or when you're a new parent, it's worth $1.15. So think about the huge motivation it is to feed new parents way more stuff and collect way more data and make it way more personalized and specific. And as we know from working in this long time, fear does a really good job at driving a lot of views and addiction and constant connection to those advertisements, and then also further isolation, which has already been a huge cultural problem for parents. And then we create these addictive and separation making technologies in this space and go, isn't this better? Don't you feel better? And like you're being guided and supported, but it's moving people further away from their bodies, from their communities, and from their babies. And it's very, very, very profitable. It's been working in obstetrics for a long time, and it's definitely working for baby tech. Quick, what's 8? But this is a quick map. I need to get better about making these sort of charts, these like conspiracy theory walls with the red yarn. I've tried to make this as close to like red yarn as possible. But if you want to like quickly take a look at this, this is how the progression, one example of the progression on how something like Happiest Baby on the Block became Happy Baby Inc. That's selling baby fart data to who knows what third-party companies for what ends, and making it seem like a $1,500 crib makes you a good parent. And also, if you haven't come across this bit of information, is that the SNU is asking parents now to submit petitions to the FDA to have it fast-tracked through the regulatory process, because there's like a side channel that whatever designers, engineers, companies can use if they can prove that it's a life-saving device, that it can skirt a lot of responsibility and analysis and regulation by saying that it's saving babies' lives. And of course, proving a negative, like all these babies didn't die because of this crib and not because of the myriad of other factors, is something, it's really hard to prove a negative. So this narrative gets pushed really hard, and is effective, and part of it is not just because it's baby saving. That's a bit of like a gloss over, because the only sort of like baby saving thing about the SNU is that you strap the baby down in a swaddle. Like none of the rest of it has anything to do with safety, but that's kind of the origin myth there. But instead, it's because they can make a lot of money trying to get parents to figure out how to get their baby to sleep through the night using this thing, and it doesn't work, and you can't track it if you don't put your baby in the bed. So like I had a colleague get fired one time in the middle of the night. She called me in tears the next day because the client fired her for holding the baby too much while the baby cried because it fucked up the SNU data. So that's an extreme example, but I get messages from birth workers all the time with stories about, and I've experienced it too, with parents running in panic because the outlet goes off or the SNU doesn't work, and you can be there holding the baby, or you're told don't hold the baby because it's a bad habit, or we need to track this, or don't do this like normal, don't feed the baby when you're supposed to feed the baby because we have to put it into the app and the, whatever. So we've all experienced this to a certain extent. But it's really malicious that it's being marketed as life-saving and skirting these boundaries. I've already kind of touched on these sorts of things, but I will just say that, again, to reemphasize the fact that it's actually really, really hard to opt out of the technocracy. And it's really, really, really hard to opt out of the technocratic model of birth and parenting. Even for those who are not buying the SNU and not using the outlet. And it's going to get increasingly worse because, again, I wish that I didn't ramble so long. We could have watched that video from the outlet founder, but basically all of this data extraction is going to shape policy. They're able to take it to the CDC, to the NIH, to create policies that say this is what good parenting is, this is what a healthy baby is. And then parents are going to be expected to have that be their experience, or else they're going to deviate from that. And then we're going to get to a place, I mean, we already are in terms of like the cultural wars around sleep training or not, and attachment and productivity and body feeding and not, and getting to the point where it's, who determines what a good parent is and what a good baby is. And that's going to be so deeply ingrained in what insurance covers. So there's companies here in the Bay, and I know elsewhere, that will cover surveillance technology for babies, but won't cover doulas. I know that there's one family that their company, which was, they worked at a big tech company, and their Nana would get covered, but only if they got the monitor. So they wouldn't cover just the video. They had to get the pulse ox sensor. So even for folks who don't want to be tracked and are concerned about privacy or believe that they fundamentally can raise kids without this, they're not going to be able to increasingly, or it's going to get harder and harder. So why we all should care is, I didn't want to get that much into kind of the speculative sci-fi scary bits of how this can potentially, and has been in some ways, contributing to the carceral state, because honestly, I mean, I'm very, very, very concerned about that, seeing what's happening in parents' homes already, and seeing what's happening in terms of, I have a legal research background, so I like reading about different court cases that come through the pipeline about this, and a lot of the stuff around algorithms being used in foster care networks and child protective services. And I mean, we already have the like ankle monitors on infants in hospitals. Like there's definitely some scary future applications. And again, looking at law and culture needs to catch up. And I think these are one of these things that it's probably going to be hard for us to like bring up randomly with our clients. Like, maybe you shouldn't be helping to collect all this data on your baby, because maybe 5 years from now, it's going to contribute to a bunch of kiddos being taken away from their parents for being bad parents. But it's definitely something that isn't just noise, and it isn't just science fiction. And considering the history of just the carceral state that we have, and the class and racial elements of that, and how technology has been used inappropriately to contribute to those spaces, like, we need to care about it. And I specifically, birth workers and people who work in reproductive health need to care about that. And I'm like preaching to the choir here, but yeah, it's not that far off and scary. The LAPD is using algorithms around child protective services and foster care already. And there are some states that have gotten ahead of the curve and don't allow monitoring technologies to be used on on children under the age of 12 for any sort of reasons that would contribute potentially to foster care. But anyway, scary thing. And then just larger, again, I don't think I need to get that deep into it with all of you, but just why are we separating the experiences of our bodies ever more through technology and our brains? Our brains and our bodies are not totally separate. Anyone who's witnessed an unmedicated birth, I think, would have a really hard time claiming that the mind and body are completely separate, or that the person who's growing the baby and giving birth, that it's a completely separate being from the person or persons that they're giving birth to too. I mean, the science doesn't back that up, but the technology that says let's divide and conquer keeps promoting itself as the one true science. So there's a lot of issues around all of these sorts of things. And hopefully we'll get into some stories around that and questions around that in the Q&A. I'm not going to get into this network of, didn't think I would, but I wrote an essay called The California Parent Ideology that gets into this. They call it in China the 996 policy, like constantly working, and burnout. And if you listen to my podcast, I just read that essay basically aloud for the podcast last week, so you can hear it. We're talking about how this like ambient tech contributes to the way our work is changing in a much broader sense, or all right, so I want to open it up to Q&A because my throat hurts and I'm very curious what people have to think. So I want to ask of everybody, I want to hear everyone's questions, but I'm also very curious about what people think is the way out of this, or how can we create a better world where technology is going to be a part of our lives forever and increasingly, but how do we make it not the worst? So open the floor up to everybody.
I just want to check in really quick. We are recording. Would we like to stop recording during the Q&A session? How do people feel about that? I will leave it up to you. I want to leave some time for people to ask questions when it's not recording, but also like if we just want the entire Q&A session to be unrecorded, that's okay too. Because maybe people feel like they can speak more freely during that.
I'm completely open either way, so I'll leave it to the group, I guess.
Okay, great. We can just pause the recording maybe for now, and then awesome. So for those of you who are watching, we just wanted to have space to take questions privately. So thank you for your patience. I guess you weren't patient because it just skipped to this. Just kidding. So anyways, yeah, this has been so illuminating, and thank you so much, Emily, for sharing with us. Like, I would love to just even like have you back for a follow-up at some point to talk about the piece about the carceral state. Like, that is so interesting to me, and like how can these technologies be weaponized against people in the future, and like where is this leading us? I'm so curious. So definitely I'm going to be continuing to follow you on Patreon and on social media. And I think everyone else would love to do that as well. So if you would like to share with us where we can find you, where we can find your social media and your podcast and your Patreon, I will link those here in the chat. And I also, since we did record this session, I want to let everyone know that we will be releasing the recording. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like yet, but watch our social media. We will be posting there. And that's where we will ultimately share the recording. And we'll also, is it okay if we share the slides too, Em?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Cool. So we'll share the slides, we'll share the recording, and let us know if you have any other questions. But yeah, let us know where to find you.
Sorry, like I said, I get distracted by the chat. So I can be found at Rosewood Repro, R-E-P-R-O, on Instagram. And then my Patreon is patreon.com/rosewoodrepro, and memberships start at $5 a month and go up from there. And that helps support the research that I'm doing. I'm shifting out of client work mostly for the next couple months and focusing just on research. So I will be publishing a lot more there in the coming weeks. One article that I'm partway through about the carceral state and some kind of predictive understandings. It's a lot of research, and I want to make sure to not mess it up. So I'm taking my time with that, but that'll be out soon. And then my podcast is the Rosewood Doula Pod, and you can find that pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. And it's a big help if you listen to that. And then I, have people interview people on all the time, and people can pitch ideas even if they don't want to be interviewed. I definitely want to focus on what people actually want to hear. I'm on Facebook, but I check it about once every 8 weeks. So, probably not going to find me on there very much. And then you can feel free to email me at doula@rosewoodconsult.com. I really like to hear people's stories. It's a really big help for me as I'm doing the research, is to hear. I'm only one person working in only so many homes. So really, really, really like to hear from doulas and how I can help make this a better, safer experience for all of us. So thank you for having me on. I love being part of this series. I'm really excited about your upcoming training. So thanks.
Great. I think that we can go ahead and end the recording now.
Yeah.